I moved to South Dakota because I wanted distance. Not a fresh start. Not adventure. Just space between me and everyone else. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone. My parents had been pushing me out of the house for years, and eventually I stopped arguing. When I started looking for places, I skipped cities completely. I didn't even want a neighborhood. I found a small rental in one of the snowier parts of the state, surrounded by open land where houses were spread far enough apart that seeing another person felt optional. That isolation didn't bother me. It felt overdue. For years, nothing happened. I went to work, came home, and kept to myself. I never introduced myself to the neighbors, mostly because there didn't seem to be a reason to. Out there, privacy was normal. Weeks could pass without seeing another car drive by. Then came the storm. It started while I was still at work in early February. At first, it was routine snowfall, the kind no one takes seriously in South Dakota. But within an hour, the wind picked up hard. Visibility dropped fast. The roads turned white and unfamiliar. My boss sent everyone home early. I wasn't overly concerned. I drove a lifted truck and had handled worse conditions before. Still, there were moments on the drive where even I had to slow down and focus. By the time I reached my driveway, the storm had already turned aggressive. I parked, stepped out into the wind, and walked up to my front door. The lock wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. The mechanism was frozen solid. I tried warming it with my hands, breathing on it, even hitting it harder than I should have. The door didn't budge. Snow was collecting on my shoulders, while I stood there realizing how bad this was. I had no lighter, no tools, no backup plan. I went back to my truck, turned the heater on full blast, and told myself I'd wait it out. Maybe the storm would ease up. Maybe I'd figure something out. But it didn't slow down. It got worse. Within minutes, snow had piled up around the tires. I tried pulling out anyway. The wheels spun uselessly. That's when it hit me. If I waited much longer, I'd be stuck there for the night. I didn't know my neighbors. I had no one nearby to call, and staying in that truck until morning wasn't an option. So I did the one thing I'd avoided since moving out there. I stepped back into the blizzard and started walking toward the nearest house. The walk felt longer than it should have. The wind was cutting sideways, stinging my face and filling my boots with snow. Every few steps, I had to stop and get my bearings because the landscape kept disappearing behind blowing white. By the time I finally saw the outline of the house, my hands were numb and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. It was a small, one-story place, sitting alone like everything else out there. Even through the storm, I could tell it was in rough shape. Paint peeling, porch sagging slightly, one dim light on inside. I knocked harder than I meant to. For a moment, nothing happened. I was just about to turn away and force myself to try the next house when the door suddenly flew open. The man standing there startled me enough that I actually stepped back. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Nothing about his face stood out. No scars, no strange expressions. Just aggressively ordinary. He stared at me for a second too long before finally introducing himself as Joe. I explained what had happened. The storm. The frozen lock. My truck. Stuck. He listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, then stepped aside and let me in. The warmth hit me immediately. My body almost collapsed in relief. Joe pointed to the couch and told me to sit. He dropped into a worn armchair across from me. At first, everything felt off, but manageable. I tried making small talk, asked how long he'd lived out there. If the storms were usually this bad, he answered, but his attention kept drifting. His eyes never settled. They jumped from me to the floor, to the ceiling, to the hallway behind him. Mid-sentence, he just stopped talking. Not like he forgot a word, like he forgot me. At one point, he stared at a blank section of wall for so long that I wondered if he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. Then, suddenly, he'd snap back and continue like nothing had happened. I told myself he was nervous. A stranger had shown up in the middle of a blizzard. That explanation made sense. Still, the longer I sat there, the tighter my chest felt. Eventually, I said I was exhausted and asked if I could sleep. The reaction was immediate. Joe looked relieved. He gestured to the couch and said I could crash there for the night. I asked if we could turn off the light. He flicked it off, without hesitation. But he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway, motionless. I lay back on the couch, pretending my eyes were already closed, my heart pounding hard enough that I was sure he could hear it. He stayed there for what felt like a full minute, just watching. Then, without a word, he finally turned and walked down the hallway. I tried to sleep. I really did. But every time I started drifting off, a deep sense of wrongness dragged me back awake. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It felt like something was waiting. About an hour later, I heard it. A heavy thump, followed by a slow, scraping sound, and it was coming from directly above me. At first, I told myself it was the storm. Heavy snow can shift on a roof. Ice can crack. Old houses make noise. I repeated that in my head like a mantra, while staring up at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. But the sounds didn't stop. They came in bursts. A dull thud. Then dragging. Then silence. Long enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it until it happened again, and then something hit the ceiling hard enough to make the entire room shudder. I shot upright on the couch. That's when I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He hadn't turned on the light. I hadn't heard him walk back. He was just there, half visible in the darkness, staring straight at me. Judging by the way he didn't react when I moved, he'd probably been watching me for a while. My skin prickled. I opened my mouth to speak, but I never got the chance. He rushed me. He vaulted over the back of the couch and slammed into me with enough force to knock the air out of my lungs. We crashed onto the floor, limbs tangled, the impact rattling my teeth. It took a second to realize what he was trying to do. He was going for my neck. His arm locked in, squeezing hard. He was stronger than he looked. Panic strength, the kind that doesn't fade. I clawed at his arm, kicked, twisted, anything to get pressure off my throat. He started yelling. Not at me, at something else. He kept saying that she was lonely, that she'd been waiting, that I needed to stop fighting because she wouldn't like it. I wasn't listening. I was focused on staying conscious. I managed to get one knee up and shoved with everything I had. He lost balance, just long enough for me to break free. I rolled, scrambled to my feet, and ran. I didn't grab my phone. I didn't grab my boots. I didn't even stop to put my coat on. I went straight for the front door. Behind me, Joe screamed. As I tore the door open, I heard him shout something that froze my blood. She's not going to be happy. I didn't look back. The cold hit me like a wall, but adrenaline drowned it out. I ran blindly into the storm, barely able to see, my lungs burning as I forced myself forward. I don't remember the distance. I don't remember the pain. I just remember pounding on the next door I saw until my hands hurt. It opened almost immediately. A man and a woman stood there, shock written all over their faces. They took one look at me, shaking, barefoot, half frozen, and pulled me inside without asking a single question. I collapsed onto their couch. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee I could barely hold, I told them everything. Halfway through, the man interrupted me. He asked one question. Was his name Joe? I nodded. The moment I said his name, the room changed. The man across from me leaned back in his chair like he'd just had something confirmed. His wife went quiet, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. Neither of them looked surprised. The man introduced himself as Brandon. His wife's name was Kathy. Brandon told me Joe had lived out there for years, long enough that most people knew better than to deal with him unless they absolutely had to. He said Joe kept to himself, but not in the normal, harmless way people out there usually did. Then Brandon told me the part no one said out loud. About 10 years earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. No body, no witnesses, no official investigation that went anywhere. People talked, people suspected, but out there, suspicion didn't turn into action unless someone could prove something, and no one ever could. I didn't tell them about the way Joe kept saying she. I didn't tell them about the sounds on the ceiling. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to hear it said out loud. Later that morning, once the roads were clear enough, Brandon drove me back to my place. The storm had passed, leaving everything buried and eerily quiet. My truck was half covered in snow, exactly where I'd left it. Nothing looked disturbed, no broken door, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that I'd almost been killed a few hours earlier. I reported what happened to the police anyway. They listened. They took notes. They said, they look into it. Nothing ever came of it. I still live in that house. 3 years later, nothing like that night has happened again. But every time I drive past Joe's place, I get the same crawling feeling in my skin, like something there remembers me. The only good thing to come out of that night is Brandon and Kathy. We stayed in touch. I got close with them in a way I probably never would have otherwise. Still, whenever I sit in their kitchen, I think about Joe and his wife, and what might still be sitting alone in that house during every storm. Years later, I was living somewhere else. Different state, different life. Still winter, still snow. I was 27 and living alone in upstate New York, working remotely in finance. The kind of job where you can go days without leaving the house if you don't need to. That week, the local news had been warning about an incoming blizzard. The kind they don't usually exaggerate, so I stocked up on groceries, went home, and planned to ride it out. By nightfall, the wind sounded like it was tearing the world apart. Around 10:30, I heard a heavy thud outside, followed by something dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch. Then I heard a car horn. The horn wasn't a normal honk. It was weak, uneven, like someone had leaned on it by accident and didn't have the strength to press it properly. I stood by the front window and watched the headlights glow through the snow near the end of my driveway. Nothing moved. The storm was bad enough that I couldn't even tell what kind of car it was. After a few minutes, I stepped back from the window and tried to convince myself it wasn't my problem. People slid off the road out there all the time. That didn't mean I needed to risk myself by going outside. 15 minutes passed. Then there was a knock at my front door. I didn't open it. I stood a few feet back and called out, asking who it was. A man answered, his voice strained and breathless. He said his car was stuck and that he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. Part of me felt guilty. If he'd really been walking through that storm, he had to be freezing. Still, I didn't unlock the door. I cracked it open instead, keeping the security chain latched. The man on my porch was coated in snow. His jacket, his shoulders, even his hair. He was shaking, teeth chattering, hands tucked close to his chest. He said his phone had died. Said he'd been walking for a while, looking for a house with lights on. I was just about to let him in. Then I looked down. His boots were clean, not just free of snow dry. No ice packed into the treads, no slush clinging to the signs. If he'd been walking through a blizzard, even for a short distance, that wouldn't have been possible. My stomach dropped. I told him I'd call for help, that someone would be on the way. His expression changed. He asked to be let in again this time, more firmly. I didn't answer. I closed the door and locked it. As I walked away, I heard him say something on the other side. I couldn't make out the words. I grabbed my phone and called 911. While I was explaining the situation, I heard footsteps move from my porch toward the side of the house. The operator told me to stay inside and lock all doors. She said officers were being dispatched, but warned me response times might be delayed because of the weather. I moved to a side window and peeked out. The man was standing near the corner of my house, about 15 feet away. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, looking up at the windows. A few seconds later, the banging started. Not at the front door. At the back. The entire door shook in its frame. I dropped the phone, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and stood there, listening to the noise echo through the house. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood frozen, knife shaking in my hand, not knowing whether that was better or worse. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but it was probably closer to 20 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't breathe properly. I just listened, waiting for the sound to come back. Instead, I heard the horn, one long, continuous blast. It cut through the wind like a warning. Not long after that, Red and blue lights flickered through the snow outside. The police had arrived. I didn't realize how tense my body was until I felt my knees almost give out in relief. The officers searched the area while I stayed inside. When they came back, they told me they'd found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank down the road. The engine was cold, not recently driven. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. Then came the second. They said there were no footprints leading from the car to my house. The snow between the road and my property was completely undisturbed. But there were footprints. They were all over my driveway, around the sides of the house, near the back door, and they stopped abruptly at the edge of the driveway. Like whoever made them hadn't walked there, like they'd arrived another way. The officers stayed for a while longer, checked the doors, then eventually left once the storm started getting worse again. There wasn't much else they could do. That night, I'd barely slept. The next morning, after the blizzard had finally passed, I went outside to look around. That's when I saw the handprints. They were on the exterior wall beneath my bedroom window. Muddy. Smudged. Clearly human. They hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. And somehow, they hadn't been noticed during the police search either. It looked like someone had been standing there, pressed up close to the glass, watching. A few days later, I heard about another house nearby that had been broken into during the storm. About half a mile away, the owners hadn't been home, and nothing was taken. No electronics, no cash, nothing. Whoever broke in hadn't been there to steal. That was the part I couldn't shake. I told only a few people about what happened. My wife, my brother, one close friend I trusted not to laugh it off. Everyone agreed on one thing. I'd done the right thing by not opening the door. Even now, years later, I still don't have an explanation. I've accepted that I probably never will. Sometime after that, my life changed again. Different country, different mountains, same cold. I was living in British Columbia, and for most of my 20s, skiing had been my entire life, and that's where the last story begins. By the time I was living in British Columbia, skiing wasn't a hobby. It was my profession. I'd spent most of my 20s racing alpine, competing nationally for years before my body finally told me it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic ended my career, just the quiet accumulation of injuries that come from throwing yourself down mountains for decades. Walking away at 26 felt right, and it gave me something back. Freedom. I started skiing backcountry more seriously. Remote terrain. No lifts. No crowds. I was avalanche trained, wilderness first aid certified, and obsessive about safety. I checked forecasts. I carried the right gear. I knew the risks. I'd skied alone plenty of times without incident. That day was supposed to be routine. The forecasts called for light snowfall. Avalanche conditions were listed as manageable. I checked them the night before, and again that morning. Everything looked acceptable for a quick solo run. By the time I started climbing, things were already shifting. The snow picked up faster than expected. The wind changed direction, stronger than predicted. Visibility dropped uncomfortably fast. The smart decision was obvious. Turn around. I didn't. I told myself I'd take one run and leave early. I've replayed that decision more times than I can count. 2/3 of the way down, the mountain moved. It didn't feel like falling. It felt like being taken. The snow gave way and carried me with it. I was lucky. The avalanche was small, enough to knock me off my skis but not bury me. I tumbled and slammed into something solid. My left leg exploded with pain. One ski was gone. I couldn't stand. The storm was worsening. Waiting wasn't an option. Digging in wasn't either. So I started moving. I used my remaining pole like a crutch, forcing myself downhill one step at a time. Every movement hurt. I focused on staying conscious and staying upright. That's when I heard someone behind me. I turned, convinced I was hallucinating. There was another skier, He moved toward me through the snow like he'd always been there, fully equipped. Calm, flash, real. He asked if I was hurt, and didn't hesitate when I told him. He stepped in close and let me lean on him. We moved together. I don't remember most of what we talked about. Only one thing stuck with me. At Somi Point, Saeed hadn't he used his legs in a long time, and that it felt good to be back on solid ground. I left. I didn't understand it. At one point I stopped to catch my breath and leaned against a tree. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. When I opened them, he was gone. No sound. No movement. No tracks in the snow besides my own. I yelled for him. Nothing answered. I don't know how I made it back to my car. I drove myself to the hospital. The doctor told me my leg was badly sprained, not broken. I'd been lucky. Days later, while recovering, I read about a skier lost in a storm on the same range weeks earlier. No body ever found. I still ski. I just don't go alone anymore, and I still don't know what helped me off that mountain.